Hi, I'm Benjamin. I'm leading BCG's public sector practice in Central Europe and Middle East. My today's guest is Ben Rhodes. He is one of the key insiders of the Obama administration, especially on foreign policy. Today, he's a political commentator and a writer. And I'd like to talk to him about what can we expect from the Biden administration, especially from a European perspective and especially from a business perspective. Ben, great to see you. Let's start with how excited are you about the Biden administration?
Well, it's equal parts relief and equal parts excitement for the future. I think there's a sense among many of us that America came perilously close to losing our democracy and frankly, putting the world in an incredibly difficult situation. But at the same time, there's COVID, there's an economic crisis, there's been a rapid decline in American influence around the world. So I'm excited about what can be done. But having been there myself in 2009, when we had a financial crisis, I'm mindful that there's no way that Joe Biden will meet expectations. And that's something that everybody has to keep in mind. He's not going to be able to make everybody happy, but he can make a lot of progress.
So obviously we are following this very closely from Europe. But if you could navigate us a bit, so who will be the key players of the new cabinet?
Well, Joe Biden has turned to people that I worked closely with in the Obama administration, but also people who worked with him for a long time. So Tony Blinken, who's Secretary of State, was Joe Biden's longtime staffer in the Senate. But I think that at the beginning of an administration and the way they built this administration, the White House always sets the tone. So even if you have big cabinet advisors like Janet Yellen and Tony Blinken at State, I would look to the White House, particularly in this first year, Ron Klain, the chief of staff, Brian Deese, the head of the National Economic Council, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. Those are the people who are really going to be setting a direction, launching initiatives that later in the administration will live in the cabinet agencies. So I'd watch those White House players in the coming months here.
Yeah, that's interesting. And if you turn now to the agenda, so some of the elements are obviously shaping up in terms of COVID relief, but also turning back some of the Trump executive orders. What we are asking from a European perspective is, what do you see out there coming in terms of trade, but also climate, which is obviously very much dear to our heart and which has to involve global policies. But then maybe also an area that I heard you talk about a lot, like is the area of tech regulation. If you could think about those three areas, so where do you see this going? How ambitious do you see can the agenda be?
Well, I think that there's a recognition in Democratic Party circles that the issues have changed, the agenda has changed. On foreign policy, terrorism in the Middle East and Russia dominated the last 20 years. On domestic policy, fights over healthcare really dominated the last decade. And now it's climate change, it's technology, it's innovation. Those are the things that are really going to animate a Biden administration. So after the COVID relief bill, what I would look for in their domestic agenda is a very significant climate bill, a spending package focused on clean energy, infrastructure, the electric grid, electric vehicles, really as big a number as they can get, I think, in terms of investments in climate change and clean energy, coupled with a pretty aggressive regulatory approach in terms of clean power, in terms of fuel efficiency standards for cars. So I think on climate, you will see maybe not the kind of tax or price on carbon that Europe has embraced, but a pretty significant series of actions to really, really try to transform the American economy in the next 10 years. I think beyond that, on technology, there's going to be an effort to begin to try to, I think, compel big tech in the United States to self-regulate it, if you will. It's going to be hard to pass legislation. And there's also a range of concerns. There's concerns about hate speech online, disinformation, concerns about antitrust issues, concerns about privacy. I think the Biden administration will use different tools. The Department of Justice, I think, will continue to pursue probably more aggressively issues around antitrust. I think you'll see conversations with Congress about privacy, about disinformation. I think you'll see, importantly, conversations with Europe about are there shared norms, shared standards that Europe and the US can embrace to kind of send a message to tech companies about what they need to do to avoid I think, more coercive regulation going forward. And then on trade, I think this is going to be a very cautious Democratic administration. I don't think you're going to see the ambitious initiatives of TPP and TTIP that you saw in the Obama administration in our second term. They're very labor friendly. They feel very burned by the politics of trade. The Republican Party is not going to vote for trade agreements in the same way that they once did. So I think there you're going to see an American government that is more focused on industrial policy, more focused on protecting American industries, investing and prioritizing certain American industries. But on all these issues, China looms large. I think job one for the Biden team is to figure out with Europe on climate, on China, on trade, on tech, where do we agree and where do we not agree? Because the more we can reach agreement with Europe and the more Europe can reach agreement within the EU, I think the stronger position everyone will be in. That's certainly my view.
In terms of climate, it's interesting that you say there's going to be a lot of investment into infrastructure and green energy. I think that is clear. In terms of regulation, do you see a majority? I mean, we know that the Senate majority is extremely slim. And in 2 years, we don't know, and also be interested in your view on how the midterms are going to play out. So right now, the majority is very slim. But what we see a reluctance or difficulty in the European politicians already is to introduce a price per ton of CO2, right? And you see the early beginnings now, Germany, but it is, we all know it's not ambitious enough, right? But we then always use the excuse that other countries are also not joining that regulation. And so we can't do it ourselves as well, right? So we are looking especially for also a strong American push to join those regulations so that we can do that together.
No, and I think it's right. And look, I mean, Europe is far ahead of the United States in this space in terms of per capita emissions and in terms of regulation. I think the reality is legislative approaches that require congressional support, that involve regulation, that involve pricing carbon, I don't think are going to happen. You have 50 Democratic votes, and one of them is Joe Manchin from West Virginia, represents a coal state. So what does that leave you with? It leaves you with what you can do from the executive branch, what you can do through the presidential authority to regulate. That is time consuming. You have to create rules, and then the agencies have to act on the rules. And what can you do? You can put in place, very strict fuel efficiency standards for cars. You can put in place very strict requirements for power plants. That is
possible by executive action, those things that you describe?
Those are possible through executive action. And then what happens is they get challenged in the courts. The Supreme Court is very conservative, so may decide you've gone too far. I think the hope, and this happened in the Biden administration, this happened in the Obama administration. I'm confusing them now.
Normally you turn it the other way around,
Yeah, exactly. The Obama-Biden administration, because the fuel efficiency regulations from the federal level were so aggressive, the car makers just adjusted to that. And I think you're already seeing General Motors, for instance, saying they're going to move to an all-electric vehicle fleet. So your hope is that even if you get tied up in the courts, and even if people are challenging your regulations, even if you can't get Congress to put them and codify them into law, the direction you set is such that the private sector and state and local governments just decide one way or another, this is where we're going. But it's not going to be, I don't think, everything that, say, most European climate-oriented people would want, because it's going to be through executive action. But I think it is going to be more ambitious even than the Obama-era executive regulations on climate. I mean, they're going to try to push Gina McCarthy, for instance, who's the climate czar. This is what she does. She wrote those regulations, some of them under the Obama administration when she ran the Environmental Protection Agency. So they'll push as far as they can, but I don't think you'll see the type of legislative approaches that Europe would probably want.
And maybe in 2 years, I mean, maybe the map gets a bit better, if some things fall into place. But I agree, very interesting. And in terms of foreign policy, so you mentioned China, obviously for Europe also a big priority. How do you see the Biden administration look at China?
Well, I think it'll be a more competitive and confrontational approach than in the Obama years. The consensus has shifted in the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. But the difference from Trump is that Trump focused on bilateral confrontation. He focused on trade imbalances. He utilized tariffs as a kind of principal weapon, if you will. I think what the Biden team will do is they'll focus on a slightly different set of issues. So yes, state subsidies, yes, the theft of intellectual property, but very much the technology issues. And I think what the Biden team will want to do is multilateralize some of these discussions with China. So rather than pursue a bilateral trade war, for instance, as Trump did, say, can we reach alignment with like-minded countries in Europe and Asia on our concerns about the way in which the Chinese state has kind of re-entered the economy, the theft of intellectual property. But on technology, for instance, trying to figure out, okay, we understand we can't just decouple these vast supply chains. We can't just go around the world and say, you have to choose between American tech and Chinese tech. But we do have to figure out what we need to protect. Is there national security related infrastructure that does need to be protected from Chinese technology? Are there privacy concerns around data storage? Are there certain supply chains, semiconductors, hypersonic, pharmaceuticals, where we would like to have some protection from Chinese technology? And that's a complicated process, but it requires agreement among allies. And then a kind of methodical process utilizing everything from American export controls to new investments. So this is going to be a painstaking and calibrated process of decoupling versus, I think, Trump's more blunt force approach to trying to decouple the American and Chinese economies in some ways.
But it's interesting that you do expect a more nationalistic economical policy compared to the Obama years. Yeah, I think that is interesting, because I think a lot of people in Europe assume that America is going to go back there, but Biden has that characteristic, and I think those elements of the Democratic Party have grown stronger, right?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Jake Sullivan, who's a national security advisor, he and I have co-chaired this organization, National Security Action, for the last few years. Jake was very much in the consensus of, pursuing trade agreements, supporting TPP, being a bit wary of mercantilist or national industrial policy in some ways. Jake spent the last few years working on what he calls, foreign policy for the middle class,
exactly.
Which is very much how do you use the different tools available to the United States to invest in research and innovation here, to protect certain industries that have suffered, that are critical to future competitiveness for the United States, and also kind of internalize the criticism that trade agreements as pursued in the past, favored corporations over workers. Personally, the funny thing for me is I'm a fairly progressive figure, but actually I don't know how you get agreement with Europe and Asia as a bloc if you're not willing to enter into trade agreements. So they're going to want to do two things at once that are hard to reconcile. They want to achieve kind of the teamwork of TPP and TTIP, but they don't want to do so within the structure of a trade agreement. I think that's hard, but I think if forced to choose, they're going to choose the more nationalist route here. And people should prepare for that.
Okay. Maybe last thoughts on investment. So do you see the investment environment change from for let's say European companies investing into the US?
Well, I do think to some extent. I mean, if you look at it grows out of what we were just talking about, which is that in some ways, the Biden team is going to pump a lot of money into certain sectors of the American economy, right? Yeah. Which you can anticipate. And those are anything related to clean energy, anything related to kind of, future innovation. I think they're going to want to pump a lot of money into artificial intelligence, areas where they feel like we've lost a competitive edge to China. And obviously significant investments in other forms of infrastructure as well. And then in healthcare, of course, they're going to want to be expanding the reach of Obamacare. And then the converse of those types of investments, right, is that fossil fuels are obviously going to be deprioritized. I think the tech companies are going to continue, though, to be seen as kind of a strategic asset for the United States. So even though there's going to be some turbulence for the tech companies, their size and strength and importance to America, I think means that the adjustments they're going to have to make are pretty marginal. So I still think that the big tech engines of the American economy are going to continue to be there.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much, Ben. That was super interesting. And thanks for your thoughts. We are rooting for the Biden administration, and best of luck there.
Great. Thanks so much. Great talking.